Hi, this is Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and welcome to your weekly episode of the Eclectic Radical. Once again, Kennedy Cooper is my guest co-host. You can follow him on Twitter at Kennedy T. Cooper. And we are really glad to be able to welcome both Brian Matlock, former Senate candidate in Kansas, and Mike Sylvester, current state assemblyman in Maine, both of whom I am very pleased to have because we don't usually get to talk about politics in their state. Most of my friends are in New York and Central Illinois and Atlanta. So welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely.
And Kennedy, how was your week?
You know, just another week in the hell world that is 2021. I'm not sure who I hate more right now, Democrats or Republicans. They're both equally disgusting to me this week. And I've been just trying not to get in too many fights with family members. That's my only real goal, because it's been way too easy to just hear, be trying to have just a pleasant conversation with grandma. And she goes, "Isn't Joe Biden so great?" And I'm like, "No."
Or worse, you have somebody on the other side wants to talk about what a great job Mitch McConnell's doing, and it's like,
oh no, yeah.
And I got to admit, Mitch McConnell. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, so I apologize if I monologue. So Mitch McConnell wants to have it both ways. He votes to acquit like, okay, I'm definitely going to help protect my guy. And then he gives a speech like, well, he's probably guilty. So does he really think that the voting to acquit will carry more weight with the people that he's voting to acquit to stay on the same side? Or does he think that the Trump supporters will remember that he made the big speech, that he deserves it? And he's probably guilty. I'm curious what everybody thinks about that.
Well, I think, Chris, it reminds me of a friend of mine in college who used to break up with people saying, "Oh, I love you, but I don't love myself. And so I can't fully love you because I don't love myself enough." And Mitch McConnell, he loves the Constitution, except in this case. But in other cases, he really loves it. And he would love to have voted if he hadn't manufactured a situation in which he held the vote until after Trump was no longer in office, right? Had they voted it when he was in office, of course he would have voted against him. But because I held the vote for several months, I cannot vote because that would be it's just it's the loop of insanity that we just keep seeing in both parties, right? Because when you have two parties like that whose only job is to say, I am slightly less horrific than you, and that is my victory, right? Then that's the only bar you have to get over, right?
Well, and that's like the abusive nature of the Republican Party in general, is there's this mythical Republican who's fiscally responsible and believes in the rule of law and Constitution. But for some reason, that guy is never here. Instead, we've got the guy who's explaining that he would be like that, except not right now. And instead, he's going to do something completely the opposite of whatever he just said. And so that's how we somehow end up with a higher deficit after every Republican president, in spite of the fact that they talk nothing but fiscal responsibility. And so this is just typical, of their gaslighting behavior.
That's fair.
It's all austerity now. Now that we're talking about spending money on people,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's face it, that's going to be the Democrats using Republicans as an excuse when really it's that they can't control their own Senate caucus, and they think having Joe Manchin is more in the Senate is somehow more valuable than either having a progressive Democrat or a Republican who might actually be more likely to vote with them on some things than Joe Manchin if Trump hadn't made everyone insane recently.
How are things in Kansas, Brian?
Cold, very cold. It's like -17 today, supposed to get. Anyways.
Polar vortex.
What's that?
That's the polar vortex leftovers. It's getting down your way now.
Yeah. So, yeah, regarding Mitch McConnell, like when we were running, everybody in the Republican Party was running on this pro-Trump agenda because they were like, whoa, we've done studies. Anyone who has like any daylight between them and Trump, they're not going to get elected or they're not going to get reelected. And so you have like this whole party has gone so full on the Trump thing. They're sort of, I think he's good at maintaining power. We'll see what happens with the Republican Party, but I think regardless of what direction it goes, Mitch McConnell plans to be a big part of it. And so he's sort of like, can't fully cut off Trumpism because that's such a big thing in the Republican Party, but he also wants to appear like be able to not lose his head if the like Trumpians are sort of like exiled from the Republican Party. So I think he's just sort of shrewdly trying to get some of that liberal feelings of goodness that they have towards George Bush and others who they previously hated because libs just became obsessed with being anti-Trump. And so if he can do a little anti-Trump, he can get a little street cred with them, but he can also, if he votes to acquit him, then he still has solidarity with all those folks.
I just get the feeling, because Mike Pence is as loyal to Trump as it gets, but you had people shouting, hang Pence. I just get the feeling that him saying that Trump is probably guilty is going to register more with the people who were saying hang Pence than his voting to acquit. It's just a feeling I have.
Well, look, they need people to blame for the loss anyway. I mean, Trump, did not manage to get reelected, and they're going to need to find all these reasons why. And of course, the right tends to be particularly conspiratorial about these things, although not that the Democrats have been much better in recent years, because these days the liberals are all Russia. We're all Russian bots.
So last night on 60 Minutes, I would not have brought this up if you had. I was trying not to talk about this, but you mentioned Russia. So this software that every business uses was hacked. But it wasn't just that that it was hacked at this one location. This software was supposedly hacked at the root level somewhere. And this hacked batch of the software had gotten out to multiple locations. The reason that it became a thing is that someone had to come up with an explanation for it, because one of the companies using the software, their security people found out that they were being spied on. And because this company was itself a security company of some kind, they considered someone spying on them to be a really big deal. Now, the gist of the 60 Minutes story is that it was somehow Russia. But when I hear that some proprietary software has been hacked by some super secret spyware that no one has heard of, that's gathering analytical data and sending it to someone in real time, I don't think Russia, I think Google or Amazon.
I was thinking Facebook, but it could be either one of those others.
I mean, and Amazon actually contracts with the CIA. So here's your conspiracy theory for you. Is how many of the hacks that we are led to believe are Russia are really Amazon?
I think there's definitely room to wonder, and I think there's definitely, the Russia thing has become a convenient scapegoat that I think some people are very intentionally using to deflect interest from the actual sources of certain behavior.
Well, but I mean, that's the way that this software was acting. What it was doing is exactly what all these big tech companies do to us every day. What is more natural than either some third-party company or even the software manufacturer itself, who for all we know is a front for one of these evil big tech corporations we all know and love? What's to stop some business software that everybody uses from behaving exactly like Google or Facebook or Robinhood? It turns out that Robinhood's whole purpose was to give tips about how the general public was doing things to the kinds of hedge funds that were affected by Robinhood investors deciding to show solidarity over feeling cheated by Wall Street bailouts.
Well, Chris, don't you just assume that every off-the-shelf or downloaded software that you have is doing that to you? I mean, do you assume that anything that you have on your computer is not spying on you in some way or sharing information? Or
I've felt that way long before it really started to be voiced as a serious possibility. There's a reasonably old movie now. The good guy is Bruce Willis and the bad guy is Alec Baldwin, called Mercury Rising, which is about an NSA conspiracy to kill this kid who magically cracked their code because his brain worked just right to immediately get what they're trying to hide. And so they want to kill this kid, and Bruce Willis is trying to keep the kid alive. But anytime anybody goes to a computer, the NSA immediately knows exactly what they're doing. And this was back in the 90s. So how much better is technology now than in the 90s?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but the whole Russia thing or like, our feeling that, somebody is doing all these things to us, or the Republicans blaming everything on the libs, or I mean, it's the way this duality is the way it's the same conversation, right? Where nobody any longer, wins or fails on their own merits, right? And accepts the balance of that, right? There's always either there's a stopgap for failure, right? Like, I want to say I'm going to go for this, but really I don't want to get any higher than this. And the reason I can't succeed is because of, whether you're a Trump racist, right? So it's because of brown people, or it's because of Trump people, or it's because of the Republicans, or it's because of the Democrats. And if only this, whatever bogeyman you want to put out there, was not there, well, then we would be giving you all of the things that you desperately need, but we can't do that, right? And we have, I mean, we're at every level, even our like nonprofits and everything, like Justice Democrats and all of those things, right? I call it Justice Incorporated, right? This whole layer of infrastructure whose only job seems to be to ask me to give them money to save the universe, right? And I imagine, I often imagine like Superman landing and saying, "Yes, I'll save you. Send $15 to," right? I mean, it's just it's and the Democrats work the same way, right? It's like, well, no, we will not actually achieve these things, but at least we are saying we will, right? And the Republicans do the same thing, right? And so it's this duality in almost every facet of our lives. And that's why Hegel set up triangles.
Well, my sincere belief is that if left to their own devices, the Democrats will not ever pass single-payer universal health care at the federal level if left to their own devices. For exactly the same reason that the Republicans will never actually ban abortion at the federal level if left to their own devices.
What would they raise money on?
Exactly.
Right.
On both sides. Because both sides are are convinced to vote a certain way by a set of unkept promises. And when the Republican Party elects a Reagan or a W or a Trump, someone who's seen as fire-breathing anti-establishment, it's because they understand that the establishment Republican Party is lying to them about these issues, and they look for someone crazier who they think might not be lying.
Right. So in Maine, I don't know how it is in Kansas, but in Maine, when I was elected in 2016, talked to an enormous amount. That's when, there was the whole swell. We started the DSA chapters and all of the folks out protesting. But also talking to a lot of union folks and other folks who had voted Trump. And they all said the same thing, right? I was looking at an establishment candidate versus a change candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, the change was crazy, right? But I can't do this for 8 more years and, keep my home or send my kids to school or my business or whatever, right? I know that going down this road for 8 more years isn't going to get me there. So I'm going to roll the dice, right? I'm going to go all in on crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And, and maybe that'll work out better for me. And for most folks, it didn't, and that's where we end up here. But I think that, Americans are ready to throw in with anybody who has a plan of how it could get better. But everyone seems to be too afraid and disorganized to come up with a plan, right? And say, comrades, this way, and here's the next 3 steps of how we get there, right?
Well, but sometimes if somebody does come up with a plan, people attack the source or attack the messenger.
Yeah.
Or accuse somebody, my favorite, accuse somebody of accuse a black woman of carrying water for white supremacists because she disagrees with them on a political tactic.
Right. Yep. No, or somebody who's pressuring a politician, right? Oh, now's not the time, right? Yeah. There's never a shortage of people who will tell you why anything will fail, right? Like there's never austerity on those folks.
And honestly, I'm going to go out and say it here. I'm sure there are people who sometimes watch the show who might not like it, but I'll say it anyway. I really feel like there are some people who were all gung-ho for change when it was cool and are really kind of happy with the status quo if it means supporting their guys against criticism.
Right.
Now, I don't hate anybody on the squad. I don't think they're completely irredeemable sellouts because I'm disappointed in them or they won't listen to me. I think that it is unfortunate that they chose to deliberately be dismissive of certain ideas because those ideas did not come from people with direct access to them. I think that was a very bad move to make. But I don't hate them. I don't think they're sellouts. I think it's very easy to get sucked into all the Democratic Party stuff at the federal level. We know from AOC herself, they basically put you on the phones 40 hours a week as an unpaid telemarketer, trying to raise money, not even for yourself, but for the party, which means that you are inured to the dirty fundraising process, because you are forced to do it on behalf of the party, even if you are totally clean yourself.
Right. Brian, did you run as a Dem? What did you?
I ran as a socialist in the Republican Party. So,
in Canada, that makes sense.
Talk to me about that choice.
So basically, I was seeing a lot of the same thing where we have some like establishment neoliberal Dem, like, I mean, we've had increasing healthcare, housing, education costs for 50 years, and wages have been stagnant that whole time period. Like, you don't need a math degree. That can't go on forever. Like, sooner or later, there's going to be a reckoning, but it sort of benefits certain regions, certain industries, certain political parties. Like, and so in urban areas especially, it's like big finance and marketing and global trade and all of this stuff, they're doing better on average than like in rural areas. And so I was just seeing them versus this Trumpian who they sort of like acknowledge what's going on, but they blame it on immigrants, or because at the same time, globalization's like displacing people, like rural to urban, global south to global north.
Or they'll acknowledge that globalization is bad, and they'll say that the solution is somehow to invade the UN or something really weird.
So I was like, part of what's going on in America with we have like this cold civil war going on where one side's just like, oh, Trump is the only problem in America. Like, I wanted to throw up when I heard that. America's back, baby, like type of, I don't know, just triumphant, I don't know, democratic nonsense. But because they aren't recognizing what's going on with people, and they often are extremely hateful and condescending, like, oh, you backwards inbred redneck hicks. And why would anyone vote for someone who doesn't even like them? And I think the job, like the socialists, is to organize the working class, not to be organizing like finance yuppies in New York City. Like, and so I said, you know, I came from Idaho, like a very Republican area, Republican family. But in that sort of like smaller town working class agricultural economy, you see a lot of this, like what I call them good neighbor Republicans. So they're constantly like opening their homes to others, donating, volunteering. They care about like working hard in their community over careerism or any of that stuff. And so what I believe, like what led me to socialism, was trying to live out these values I got from my community. And so I think, and going to Republican events and things, you see a lot of what they talk about, they're against things. Like they aren't talking about what they're for. And so there are actually these really strange coalitions that, like, you know, maybe it's someone who's hard up and, you know, struggling. And so someone's like, oh, it's the taxes. It's like, it's not enough. And so they, you know, that you're working your butt off and barely making it, but then the government comes and takes away. But they're sort of like, if you put together like these evangelicals, libertarians, nationalists, all these things, like, so there are already contradictions present within the party. And so it's sort of heightening the contradiction. Like, why not? There are so many problematic things about socialists working in the Democratic Party. So my thing isn't like everyone should work in the Republican Party. It's like socialists should be organizing people everywhere, wherever they are. And I think there are a lot of people, like when I talked to some Democratic state senator, he was talking about, oh, well, you know, we only need to win 10 out of 100 counties in Kansas. Why would we bother going to all these rural? Like, that's the basis of our economy, is we're like a farming economy, but all those areas are dying. The Dems just want to go to like the big white flight suburbs of Kansas City and a few others, and they're just not doing the job. And so Chris Kobach, I ran against him, and so partly I wanted to argue pretty directly against that anti-immigrant nationalism. And my parents were pro-immigration Republicans. They were, like, and so I just thought, like, we need to get around this sort of good team, bad team stuff that's going on, because it's hard to. No one's organizing in those areas, but I want to say, like, y'all have suffered a lot, and here is a way better narrative of how we got here and how we're going to get away from here than this nationalism BS. And so some of the things like emphasis on hard work, local control, community things, focusing on like worker cooperatives are often pretty popular because they know that corporations are screwing them. I'm like, by the end, one of the things that I would open with a lot that would resonate with people was like, Republican socialists for people who distrust big business as much as big government. And they're all like, oh, yeah, I guess. But like a lot of them know that they're being screwed, but they sort of, so being able to like organize and validate their experience, but sort of organize them in solidarity with people of color, immigrants, women, like LGBTQ folks, rather than scapegoating them. But it, like what I hoped was also I ran against 10 other people in this. It was an open primary. And so I was like, they're all running on an identical platform of Trump's amazing, I love Trump. And so maybe I could split it enough and like win the primary. And then when going against the centrist Dem, because the Dems are even worse here about suppressing like competition for their chosen corporate candidate than the Republican Party is. And so being able to like punch the Dems hard from the left in this and say, and then pick up, like form a coalition, a working class coalition, like all the rich Republicans would like abandon ship, but then picking up like minority communities, immigrants, like other people, like from the Democratic Party, and having like, you know, we won, like, I don't know. So that was,
Good idea.
You know, and that's exactly the sort of organizing we need. The kind of inside-outside strategy that we need to follow is going to require third parties that can push the needle much further left than either of the major parties can. And it's going to involve primary people from both parties, in both parties, running in whichever party is better for their district. Let's remember that Fiorello LaGuardia was a socialist. He was a registered member of the Socialist Party of America, and that he was elected mayor of New York City on the Republican and Progressive Party platforms. The first socialist congressman from New York City was elected at the same time, also as a Republican and a member of the New York Progressive Party. So there's precedent for this stuff.
Well, you know, when I ran in 16, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
I was saying, and Kansas has a huge history of like, because it was this abolitionist state, and so all of these radical Republicans who many of them were socialists. They had like sort of, okay, we want emancipation without proclamation. Like, we're not waiting for your permission. Free people now. No compensation for slaveholders. Yes, compensation for the freed people. And
William Lloyd Garrison did the Revolutionary Communist Party thing, you know, where they actually won. The reason that it's legal and constitutionally protected to burn a flag in this country is that the Revolutionary Communist Party did it at every one of their public events for years in order to get arrested, in order to be able to sue the government to establish that First Amendment right to burn the flag. But way back before the Civil War, William Lloyd Garrison was doing almost the same thing, burning the Constitution in public, saying that the way that it kowtowed to slavery was a covenant with death. And this is one of the people who eventually started the Republican Party.
Well, y'all know. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, when I ran in 2016, I ended up running as a Democrat because, Bernie told us all we were supposed to run as Democrats so that we could support him when he was president. And, right. And I had worked as a union organizer in Vermont, and Bernie would show up to our stuff because, without even asking, because why would he do on a Thursday night besides hang out with workers, right? And, so we did that. But when I did it, I was like, well, I always thought I would run in a socialist party when I ran. If I ever, right? I never thought I would run, but if I ever thought I did, on my signs, it said Democratic Socialist and it said Labor Democrat, right? And people were like, oh, don't do that, right? You'll get trapped in your values. Like, right?
Trapped in my values.
Oh no, I'm trapped in the values of democracy and healthcare and workplace empowerment.
People eat and have a house. Right? But like, it was so great because it allowed people to like ask me what I meant by that, right? And we'd have these conversations about what, right? And so, I've won in large part. If I was not, I won my first time 82%, my second time 86%, right? And so in a lot of ways, and I come out of the labor movement, right? So in a lot of ways, the Dems had to leave me alone to let me do whatever the heck I wanted to do and sow whatever craziness I was trying to sow, because I had support in my district. I had support from, important constituents, right? And so, I got to be chair of labor and housing my second term, right? And so I think that, but at the same time, our stopgap is our governor, right? So all of the really good stuff that I pass gets vetoed, right? At that level.
For a lot of that wonderful period, you had that great pearl of humanity, Paul LePage.
Well, and who is going to run again, right?
Yeah.
And so, right, so we have this basically Republican governor, right, who does not talk to Democrats, but Republicans can walk right in, right? Chamber of Commerce can walk right in. Unions have to fight to get a meeting, right? So that's our governor, right? But now it's going to be her versus Paul LePage, who was the prototype Trump. And so, right, and so now, oh, nobody can primary her. Oh, no third party can come in, because the only way LePage was elected was there was an independent who ran both times, getting 26% of the vote, just enough for him to win with 38% of the vote, right? And so now, nobody can run against the governor because LePage will be back, right? And it's the same exact construct as Trump, right? And when LePage was in for 8 years, all we heard from the Democrats was either whatever he came up with, you had to oppose, right? For whatever reason, didn't matter, whatever. But also, right? Did you hear what he said? Send $20, right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the whole construct of the Democratic Party. Yeah. And I've really fought for a long time for can you reform one of these major parties, right? That's why I was so interested, Brian, in your thought process, because, I had the same exact process. I wrote my organizing plan and this was supposed to be my third term when I would run for speaker. But ultimately I said, you know what? I can't be the speaker of a party that I don't believe will ever reform itself, right? That will do everything that it can to make sure that we don't have single payer, to make sure that we don't have, free college, to make sure, right, including bringing in a past president to make sure everybody drops out of the race at the key moment, right? And so now I'm in this position where I feel like the legislature, at least my body, the House, has moved significantly to the left since I've been in it. We've passed some good legislation, right? Some of it has actually even been signed. And, but is that incremental piece enough? Right. Right. There are things that I'm able to do because I come out of the labor movement that we're able to push forward because of that. Right. But is that enough? Because it's certainly not systemic change.
Yeah.
Right. And how do you affect that? Right. And so that's kind of where I am right now. I mean, I'm really weighing out like what brings this all together in a way that they can't just put their foot on your neck.
So there are There are all sorts of pressures to do things fast, and they're very real, very serious, very important pressures. And I am not trying to belittle the need to say, beat certain deadlines to save certain parts of the world from climate crisis. I understand the very serious reality that we live in. But on the other hand, without trying to be a total doomer, a friend of mine believes very strongly in what they call turn signal theory, which is that if 70% of the country won't even turn their turn signals on when they make a turn, we're not going to get a revolution. Now, so what that means is we have to organize however we can to make a revolution possible, or if not a revolution, a political transition. And I honestly don't care whether you can do a systemic reform or not at this point. You've got three things. First, you need to organize the movement, and you need to have a movement that goes beyond any one presidential candidate or any one campaign at any one time, and that doesn't get bogged down in protecting its incumbents because they're incumbents. And number two, you need to have people in whatever party is best for them to run in where they are. If they're most comfortable running as a third party, then that's what they should do. If they want to win, then they should run as whatever gives them a good chance. If it's someplace where a third party candidate can win, run as third party. Run Republican, run Democrat. I don't care, but run. And run as a socialist. Don't hide what you are. Let it all hang out and give them the full message. The full message works. The full message has won elections for Democrats. They just back off it once they have power.
Right. And I think that, you know, the major part of that, I mean, even here in Maine, right, we have clean elections. We have public financing, right? You don't have to raise $1 from anybody to run for office in the state of Maine. Now, there's no money to serve.
Yeah.
Right? You know, we make $14,000 a year, you know, right? And in this last year most folks worked 40 to 60 hours because of unemployment and all those things all year long, right? But that's a whole other issue, right? But there's money to run. You don't have to do your 40 hours of call time to run to be a state representative in the state of Maine. But they feel just as beholden to those interests as the people that do it. And it makes no sense to me, right?
Yeah, that's frustrating.
No, it does make sense. And the reason it makes sense is I'm going to give you class analysis. I hate to get all theory and teach with my guests. But so our parties do represent very real class interests. The Democratic Party, since literally 1973 is when they started rebranding, almost as soon as McGovern had lost.
From labor movement to professionals.
Exactly. They became a professional. The way I will put it is I'll use the wobbly frame of reference where you have the ownership class and the working class. The Democrats targeted themselves very narrowly to the very top tier, as they saw it, of the working class. That professional managerial class in a Marxist analysis. The Republicans target themselves, or their message anyway, not what they actually do policy-wise, but Republican message is targeted at the bottom tier of the ownership class, what Marx called the petty bourgeois, your shopkeepers and your family farmers, and a lot of people who are in business and have capital, but who are not reliably able to consistently make a profit from that capital without relying on debt to a greater degree than larger businesses, which generate more of their own capital. Yes, petty bourgeois is exactly what Marx would say.
Well, you know, I've been making that argument for like 3 years now in the state of Maine because, you know, whenever socialists want to talk about reform, they, you know, for whatever reason, they really want to target that small business person Like they are capital, right? And I keep
Mm-hmm.
trying to tell them, no, those are folks with the same class interests, at least in my state.
So
right? Same class, they're working 60 hours a week. They're trying to feed their families.
Yep.
They're usually, right? And in the state of Maine, 60% of people either are small business or
Yep.
work for small business.
Yep.
Right? And so if you're going to decide that they are not part of the proletariat and must be punished simply because of your theory, right?
Well,
Then just
sure.
then right, you have to figure out a way to draw those people in on the class interest and separate them from larger business interests.
Exactly.
And the Chamber of Commerce's and all of those folks, right, in order to affect your reform, because there's never been any revolution where that petty bourgeoisie did not did not come up with the working people, right? And I think the last thing I'll say about that is, right, I mean, there was a bill, and it was to help farm workers organize unions and to help farm workers have rights under the law, right? And the small farmers were the ones that all came out, right? And so what I was trying to say to the sponsor of the bill was, A, you didn't do your organizing, but B, this needs to be a bill about small farms, right? This needs to be a bill about saving small farms and giving small farms an edge over this and helping workers at the same time. And when we looked at it that way, people were like, oh yeah, I don't care if they form a union, right? I don't care if they have rights, right? We've got to figure out the overtime so that I can pay it, right? But if there's more money coming in because this is helping small farms, right? Then of course I would pay them.
Well, it's like when people were talking about canceling rent, it makes sense if you're canceling rent to cancel mortgages too, not because you care about landlords in the big picture, but because you care about that low end of the ownership class that's struggling to get by just like everybody else in the small picture.
Yeah.
And that's really the trouble. The Republicans have policy that only helps the people at the very top. And the Democrats have policy that really only helps the people at the very top in these very, very narrow areas. And they use these professional and small business mentalities and prejudices against each other. And the working class, instead of being able to have a party of their own, basically take sides with one side or the other. And it usually ends up being these small business people with whom they feel they have more in common culturally than these professionals they feel treat them like crap because they're snooty. One of the big things that people criticized Hillary Clinton for was the deplorable comment. The deplorable comment was actually an attack on the lowest end of the ownership class as being trashy working class people. And it was really nastily classist in a very specific way that really offended the people it was targeted at and was a guaranteed loser for Hillary.
Are you sure you're not a Russian bot, though? Because you critique an H-Dog, and I don't see... Yeah,
I think this classist stuff is really important. And I think that, Brian, you kind of spoke to this, when you were just explaining your decision to run as a Republican, that like a lot of times there's this Democrat attitude that like, oh, these rural people aren't even worth talking to because none of them can be saved. But what's interesting is that, like city people have been benefiting off the back of like the death of the rural economy for like 50 years or more. And so what a lot of people are seeing now in urban areas in terms of like the kind of economic situations that they're seeing that are radicalizing them, rural people have been in those economic situations for decades already and are ripe for radicalization. And I just think back to like before
being radicalized towards white supremacy.
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah. That's because like you say, they know something's wrong. And so they're gonna go to whoever's telling them that yes, something is wrong. And if
I
that's
have a
only
plan.
one
Here's how
person,
it's going to get better, and here's the first 3 steps how to get there, right? And it leads to crazy town, but I understand. I can understand that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. So I mean, I'm glad you jumped in, because that's what it's all about. And so yeah, I just think back to before the Georgia Senate special election, all these liberals on Twitter going, Georgia's gonna reelect those Republicans. They're all a bunch of inbred hicks that we should just take that state and eject it to the moon. I mean, this was literally the kind of stuff that you're seeing these liberals write on Twitter. And then, what happens? People in Georgia are actually desperate.
Yeah.
And when they heard that the Democrats would provide more COVID relief, which was the promise at the time,
The very clear promise
somewhere, but
I have shared the picture on Twitter of the ad that Raphael Warnock ran with the picture of the $2,000 check. It is not something where somebody just promised them another $1,400 on top of the $600 they already had. The $2,000 check was in one of the senator's actual internet ad.
Yeah. So, there's always this tendency to say, oh, these people can't be helped by these classist, liberal elites, so to speak. And they can't. It's not true. I've lived poor and rural a lot of my life, and it's simply not true.
It's frustrating that that's the antithesis of what socialism was from the start. Like, you're sort of organizing people who are like, oh yeah, the serfs, they're too stupid to run like this feudal system. Oh, the slaves, oh yeah, right, they could run a plantation without me. Like, every stage, there's this condescending, these people are inherently lesser, now it's like, they're inherently racist or something, as if we're not, like, if you change the conditions, if you give people access to like education and leadership, decision making,
and food and housing
and I'll just say this, my experience with country people and city people is that a lot of country people have these outward racist habits that they've learned that they perpetuate and that make them kind of look worse on the surface.
Yes.
Because you can visibly see these signs of racism. And so that's like, oh gosh, that's scary to actually see visible signs of racism.
The N-word is, to be honest, used more frequently on the Tennessee-Virginia border than it is used here in Oregon. But that does not mean the cops here in Oregon are any less racist.
Exactly. Just because it's a quiet racism doesn't make it better. And so a lot of, city liberals have this quiet racism where they don't say any things that they're not supposed to. They don't, do any things that they're not supposed to on the internet or whatever, but they don't actually support Black people's businesses. They cross the street when they see Black people walking towards them, is that better? Is that really less racist?
And I think part of the issue is the way that the conversation happens with those people, because like, if you're in a small town that's not very diverse, you're not gonna be a critical race theorist. You're not gonna know the lingo, which part of the whole thing is like, it's sort of an ongoing conversation that changes, and it's a constant check. Like, are you up with this conversation?
I think that's a lot less important than I think right now we're at the level of don't be a Nazi and be against Nazis. And we have to start there.
Yeah, and a lot of, whether or not they use the right lingo, I think a lot of people from these areas don't see themselves as racist, and they don't know about this Southern strategy or whatever. But they're like, Republicans, we like ended slavery, and so rather than like, the liberal conversation becomes like making the case against the person they're talking to that they're racist, rather than saying like, okay, we want to like validate the like inherent value of all people and let them participate, how can we better do that? Like, and so sort of take their positive self-understandings and try to mobilize it, like do jujitsu rather than this constant like fighting, or like it's all about making the case that you're bad, you're racist, rather than sort of like, okay, let's bring people along, educate them, get it. I mean, any one of us is ignorant. Like, we learn things as we go along. And so like this idea that, so I think that is a legitimate possibility that we can be doing if we're actually organizing. The farmer labor movement, all those people, the Populist Party did very well in rural areas.
Well,
like,
let's not forget that a lot of the stereotyping of rural people isn't new either. There was a very specific stereotyping of rural people in the populist days. Now, the Populist Party was explicitly socialist and explicitly anti-racist. The only reason they called themselves the Populists, or rather specifically the People's Party, was because they did not want to use the word socialist. They wanted to do a jujitsu thing, like Brian was talking about. So they came up with the People's Party, the same way that later on you got all these people's republics. And they were immediately attacked as representing this rural, white, racist, bigoted, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish subhumans, as opposed to people who were asking for this specific set of things because they were the ones who dug in the mines and cut the wheat and husked the corn. And the word redneck was associated deliberately during the mining heyday with the coal miners in West Virginia, who were blacks and immigrants and white people from the Appalachians, who were collectively bombed by the U.S. government at the Battle of Blair Mountain. One of the very few times that U.S. planes have dropped bombs on U.S. protesters. So let's say right now, too, that there is absolutely precedent for things that Trump did, and that those things have been done under both Democratic and Republican presidents.
Well, one of the interesting things, I think, when I entered the labor movement, right, in the 90s, I was a kid coming from Maine, right? I looked at the labor movement. There was all this really exciting immigrant organizing that was going on. And, I eked my way into the apprenticeship program through the AFL-CIO, and they said, "Where are you from?" "Maine." "You speak Spanish?" "No." You speak Arabic?" "No." Right? There's a dirt road, right? Go drive down that dirt road and find who's down there and go organize them. And right. And so I found myself organizing nursing homes in West Virginia, and I found myself in Militia, Michigan, and I found myself organizing back in Maine and Ohio, and right. And finally, I worked my way up, and so that I was working in New York City, and towards the end of my career, I finally got all those cool immigrant campaigns, and I was working at Justice for Janitors in Boston, working with, higher ed janitors and custodial folks, and working with security officers, right, in all those downtown buildings, right. And I thought, oh, this is where I fought to be, right. And then Trump got elected, and I had that analysis that I talked about earlier, about folks just saying, I can't make it the way this country's going. And I realized that down those dirt roads was all the organizing that needed to be done the whole time, right? It wasn't this cool thing like you were talking about, Brian, in the cities, right? It was like those folks who were struggling down there. And people will say to me, I represent Portland, right, which is the biggest city in Maine, right? But what I'm always talking about is the rural economy, right? And I have a bill to build solar trains up in the most rural part of Maine, right? Because that's where the jobs need to be, right? And Portland doesn't work, and the rest of Maine doesn't work, right? And that's the kind of thinking that that people get really scared about, because if you start thinking about the whole working together, right? Well, then maybe that's going to take a piece away from me.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And how do you spell out that dream, right? Whether it's a third party, right? God forbid the third parties get any rights, right? Because that might mean a Democrat or a Republican doesn't get elected. And if you ever want to see Democrats and Republicans come together, propose something that gives rights to independents or third party. They'll clap down on that in a heartbeat, right? And so that's, to me, until we break that dualistic two-party system, we can't get anything done.
Breaktheduopoly.org. Everybody check it out right now. Support national ranked choice voting. Sorry, you gave me the perfect lead for that plug.
Yes, indeed. It works here in Maine, I'll tell you that. All right. Yeah. And but they stopped it past the primary level, right? Mm-hmm. You can't have ranked choice voting when you're actually voting for but in the primary you can have it, right? Because the Constitution maybe says, plurality and majority and, right? So I mean, there's always the stopgap. And that's, so when I talk about systemic change, that's the stuff I'm talking about, right? We've got to change the rules so that a regular person can go ahead and run for government.
No, right? Because if it doesn't require lots of money to run, then they don't pay you enough money to live, like you're talking about. Yep. If they do pay you enough money to live, it requires a lot of money to run, and you have to do more for them to collect that payday.
Yep.
And when they're promising you lifetime pay and lifetime health care, if you just get elected 3 times, then that's a huge incentive to get reelected twice.
Right.
Whatever it takes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, let's be honest, and let's take a step away from however radical we are in our political lives and talk about day-to-day realities. How hard would it be for you to say no if somebody offered you lifetime 6-figure pay and lifetime benefits without those benefits really coming out of your check in any significant way? Yep. Would you be able to say no? I couldn't afford to say no, honestly. I don't think.
Yeah, no, I mean, right, when you set it up in such a way that if you play ball for this amount of time, right, you get to the promised land, right? And that's the lie everybody tells themselves, right? In Maine, you can have health insurance. We have 8-year term limits. So you have to go, if you get elected to the House of Representatives, you have to go through all 4 of your terms and then win your Senate race. And then you can have state health care for the rest of your life. Right? So you just have to get reelected all of those times, doing whatever, making sure you're not trapped in your values, and then you get there, right? And every system is set up that way, right? And you hit on a key fundamental part, and there's like the carrot, and then there's the stick, right? The other reason that progressive or lefty legislation doesn't get passed is because I'm going to get a dirty postcard in my reelection campaign, right? I mean, I had, overdose protection site bill that I ran twice, and both times I had the committee all ready to go, including Republicans, and both times it got whipped by leadership because, if you voted for this, you're going to get a card in your mail that says you support crack houses. Right. Forget that we're going to save lives. Forget. Right. And that's the reality. Is it's all about the reelection.
And my impression of incumbents, even our progressive incumbents who were so great when we elected them, or even when we reelected them, incumbents, if they are too comfortable, are going to err on the side of caution because they are ruled by fear and dependent on consultants who give them reasons to be less afraid. And the fact that incumbents are ruled by fear, and honestly, obviously, I don't mean anybody on this stream. A lot of people in politics are not profoundly intelligent.
Oh, it's crazy who gets elected.
It really is. It really is. And when you understand that that the combination of being ruled by fear of not getting reelected and not being profoundly intelligent makes you dependent on these people who both convince you that they're brilliant and make you feel less afraid. I mean, you've got this industry that's there to take advantage of politicians and make sure nothing gets done, almost without the politicians even having to be corrupt, because they're dependent on this whole political middleman class that is completely corrupt.
I talk about it they say that economics is the science of lies because you can change the numbers to mean whatever you want, but really political science is the system of lies, right? It's the science of lies, because I have to, as a candidate, say that you are worse than you are, and also say that I am better than I am, right? And in order to get elected, and then once I get elected, I need to make sure not to do the things that is going to upset anybody, right? Because if I upset somebody, it's going to, it's going to somehow, make sure that I don't get reelected, so that I can't run again saying how great I am because I tried to do those things or whatever, right? And I just, when I look at it, I just say, someone has to say, why did you run for this seat to some of these people at the point that they're running? Because folks come in and I say, what did you run? What did you run for? What do you want to put bills? Do you want to put in whatever? And they say, oh, I don't know. I just thought it would be neat to run for,
And what's worse is those are the people who are encouraged to run.
Yes, indeed.
Those are the people.
Those people win a lot.
Yes. So there are so many races that I was involved in the 2020 cycle, where it was literally someone running. The person was either an incumbent or was running for a seat an incumbent was giving up because it was their turn, because it was time for them to go to Congress. It was very common for people in some very Democratic districts to be offered a city council seat if they just didn't run for Congress this year because someone on a city council was the favored candidate. And it's or a candidate who was running simply because they felt that they were entitled to be the nominee for the Democratic Party, and that to the point where anybody running against them had to genuinely be evil. And they didn't even have any real program. They just wanted to be in Congress. But anybody running against them had to be evil.
I can't help but think of a... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in Dems, when they don't actually want any progressive legislation, well, what are you going to stand for then? It's almost always austerity. Well, we'll balance the budget or something. I mean, that's what Obama term 2 focused on that. And it's just like economic malpractice. And I don't know, it's just so frustrating to see them. Like, they're like, oh, I don't actually stand for anything. So,
well, they stand for not being the Republican. The only thing Democrats stand for anymore is not being the Republican. That doesn't mean having different policies than the Republican. Often their policies on 85% of things are the same as the Republican, but they stand for not being the Republican.
Just thinking about this goofy attitude a lot of people have towards running is making me think about a Puff piece I just read recently about our mayor. here in Albuquerque, Tim Keller. He's sometimes known as the heavy metal mayor. And he's a relatable guy for this reason, because he listens to rock albums, unlike most mayors who just listen to classical or something while they snort cocaine. I don't know. And Tim Keller, this piece is talking about, so he comes from a well-off family, and this piece is talking about like kind of how he grew up and how his brother grew up and stuff. And they were at a Slayer concert, and he just looks at his brother and says, "I'm going to run for mayor." And that's how he decided it. Like it wasn't like when socialists run, it tends to be this thing where you're bringing together orgs and you're talking like, hey, let's get someone into this particular office, because here's the changes they could make in this office. Here's some of the legislation we want them to run on. You know, there's like this like organized like community effort. This was just like some rich guys in a mosh pit looked at each other and said, "Hey, you think I could be mayor? That'd be funny, right?"
Well, yeah, that's how it is a lot of the time.
Well, I think because socialists generally look at elected seats as a tool in the toolbox and not an end, right, in and of itself, right? And I think that's the part that centrists really look at, the seat an end, right, is gaining the power. So important because you're saving that space of power to protect corporate, interests.
So,
right?
well, let's talk about linguistics for a moment, because this is a really good point. The word liberal, when you break it down to what it really means, the only people who are capable of being liberal are members of the ruling class and their favored elite flunkies. Because liberalism requires being privileged and then being properly generous without being too equal with the people beneath you. That's really what liberalism means. The Liberal Party in England was substituting opening up political rights to the working class and people who didn't own property so they wouldn't have to give them economic rights or jobs.
Yeah.
And I had a funny conversation the other day with, some kids who were, wondering how we ended up with a representative government, right? Instead of people just voting on everything, right? Which is a really good question, right? And they're like, well, how did they decide that it was going to be this way? And so I had to reach back to Zen and say, well, John and Sam Adams were telling a bunch of poor folks that they should rally against the taxes that were unfair, that were really just taxes that they didn't want to pay. And then John Adams walking home saw his friend the tax man be pulled out of his house and tarred and feathered by these people that they were just talking to. And he said, whoa, those poor people are crazy. We need to make sure that we have somebody who's voting on their behalf so that they can't actually pull me out of the house someday and tar.
Well, and one of the best parts of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States is when he talks about the first draft of the Pennsylvania State Constitution, which explicitly said large amounts of wealth in private hands are detrimental to the political freedoms of the rest of the colony. Now, that was not the version of the Pennsylvania State Constitution finally ratified.
Yeah.
I wonder why not. I think one of the funniest things, I was actually talking about this on Twitter today, I think one of the funniest things that you'll often hear people say when you bring up direct democracy, and this ties everything together that we've been talking about tonight, is that it'll slow things down. And I just want to say, nothing could possibly be slower than the government we're watching right now. I've seen anarchist punk squats that required unanimous consent make decisions faster than this. Nothing could possibly be slower than this.
If we had direct democracy, where everybody opened an app on their phone and clicked a yes or no on whether they want stimulus, the way they do for these stupid surveys that all these corporations send after you buy something from them. we would have $2,000, $3,000 a month for everyone. We would have emergency Medicare for all, and they would probably vote to make it permanent afterwards. We would have housing for all. We would have free college. We would have a federal jobs program. We would have a guaranteed minimum income for the people who couldn't work. All these things would have happened if we really had that level of direct democracy. I believe that.
Yeah, and it would all be paid for too, because we'd also vote in huge taxes on the 1% and other, and major corporations.
Let's talk about paid for, because this is a good thing this is a good place to close out and get Mike and Brian's opinions before we go. One of the things that Ron Kim said when he was on the show was that private capital, he's in New York, so he has to think about private capital a lot. Private capital is really, really scared of stimulus to working class people to help get them through the plague, making it clear that we have more public capital than we do private capital, and that private capital is really obsolete, and that we could have a completely publicly funded state capitalism that provided for all our needs if we just got rid of the military and spent on ourselves the way we spend on the military. And that we could fund this mostly with our own deficit spending and take care of all these needs if we really prioritize taking care of those needs over making the rich richer with all these various capitalist schemes.
Absolutely. I mean, there is all of the pieces of people's needs that we're talking about are such a fundamentally small part of the federal government spending. And if we just were able to somehow shift our perspective, whether it's collecting power or whether it's collecting wealth or whether, if we were really trying to, in some sort of, collect happiness, mindset, right. And really trying to figure out how do we have the social contract where we're really, the government is really trying to provide the needs of the people. These other pieces, people wouldn't mind so much if somebody had a boat or somebody had a whatever, right? You know what I mean? Right. If they could feed themselves, if they could house themselves, if their kids could go to college, if they could, if they knew they had a basic income, if they knew, all of these things, right? There's always going to be the person who sort of pulls 3 cookies off the plate, right? When everybody else only gets 1. But if everybody gets a cookie, right, then society would run so much smoother and so people would be so much happier, and you wouldn't have to run a country on fear and desperation. And that's all they have right now. If we're not afraid and desperate, then they can't control us.
It's like the entire point of the insurance industry is to limit care, is to sort of decide who gets it. And the amount of resources we spend just sort of artificially limiting who can get care. It's very similar to when people have tried to, let's do drug tests for all food stamp recipients, but it's it saved way less money than the cost of testing everybody. And so similarly, just so many things, the way we use resources is incredibly inefficient. And if you cut out the middleman and are just okay, we'll pay for it. And I'm a modern money theory economist. So I'm also, not afraid of deficit spending and think there are a lot more creative ways we could be organizing our economy, because what matters is floating real resources. It's not a scarcity of dollars. If we're having an influx of immigrants, that's more people who can join with us in building an awesome nation.
That's-
Instead, we're like, oh no, we don't have the dollar. We literally have a printing press. Like, the issue is, are there enough resources to put to work with those dollars? And so if you're able to like have a more visionary look at like think about what we could be doing. Like, it's not like they're coming to get our limited food and healthcare. Like, they can be healthcare providers and food growers, and like, I mean, we can build something together without this sort of like
they're more taxpayers. I mean, if you really care about balancing the budget, shouldn't you want as many new tax-paying citizens as possible? And so, the advantage of preventing people from becoming documented is to allow them to be exploited because neither they nor their employers can pay taxes on them above board. So you've got this whole shadow economy that's built around these dependent captive laborers. The chicken plant, Tyson Chicken, with the mass deportations. You all remember that? What was not covered when the deportations were covered was that the workers at the chicken plant, the undocumented immigrants who were deported, had just recently won a huge lawsuit against Tyson. They were being deported because their bosses tipped off ICE to avoid having to pay out.
Yeah. And it's, we're kind of talking about like these systems of need and providing to that need, and why are there always these issues in the way? And a lot of it just has to do with this division and keeping people from helping each other. Universal systems that benefit everyone tend to be defended by virtually everyone because they all benefit from it. But like, I think it was Brian, you mentioned getting drug tested to be on food stamps, or maybe it was you, Mike, but like things, that type of means testing, what does that do? Well, if you get denied food stamps, then you're less likely to go out there and defend that program later, right? And this immigration stuff, it works the same way. You're less likely to go defend, the rights of immigrants if you don't see anything improving for you. And that's the way that like they divide these people up so much.
And we had a bill the other day about divesting the state resources from fossil fuels, in the retirement system and other places, and so the guy from the Petroleum Association came in and was talking about, well, you need plastics, right? You may not like the burning in cars and whatever, but you need plastics, right? And one of us raised that, well, you can get plastics from other sources, like biosources, and right, and all these things. And he said, well, that would need an enormous sum of money to be invested in these things, in order to have it. And and we were like, you mean sort of like the money that we have invested in fossil fuels, like that kind of money would need to be invested? And it turns out Maine has a huge bioplastic industry that's burgeoning and just waiting for some money to be invested into, right? And that's the cycle that people get in. And and I really appreciate, Chris, that you have a show, and kind of you have a show where you get to talk about these things, and and until we're all talking about it, right, then
and that's really the message that I would take to everybody who's watching, is talk about it. Talk to your Lyft driver on the way to work. If you have the chance to do it without getting fired, or if you're willing to risk getting fired, I know we can't always, organize your workplace. If you're able to organize your apartment complex, organize your apartment complex. See if there's a chapter of the debt collective, or if there's a tenants union in your area, if you can't join a labor union. There are all sorts of ways to organize. The IWW is doing great things organizing Burgerville workers here in Portland, Oregon. I mean, there are all these areas where people need help, and we can organize to help each other. And we really need to be able to organize to help each other outside of the political parties. Anything we do inside the Democratic or Republican parties is going to be co-opted if it does not have an equal shadow outside of those parties. I mean, one thing that does not get talked about nowadays is the NAACP was not part of the Democratic Party establishment during the height of the civil rights era. The NAACP was a radical outsider group. It's not anymore. Now it's part of the Democratic establishment. Joe Biden may talk to them like they're still outsiders and be a jerk, but the reason he thinks he can be a jerk on a national call like that is because he feels that as the president, he's their boss and they work for him because they're a Democratic Party interest group.
One of the things that nobody ever talks about, like the miners fighting in West Virginia against the federal government, that never makes it into a history book is, the reason that Kennedy talked with Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement was because Walter Reuther out of the UAW said, if you don't, you won't have my support. And that's the sort of thing, because he was an immigrant worker, who had fought his way, right? And those are the sorts of things where, people say, well, I have to talk in my silo and you talk in your silo, right?
Walter Reuther was also very close friends with two names that will be familiar to people who have been involved with the DSA for any certain amount of time. Walter Reuther was friends with Bayard Rustin and Michael Harrington.
Yep.
And that was a big part of that. Michael Harrington at the time was Martin Luther King Jr.'s political advisor, which is something that was relatively minor and unimportant and really isn't a huge deal. But I mean, things happen because of those relationships. Bayard Rustin would found Social Democrats USA in 1972. And then when it looked like they were going just a little too neocon on Vietnam, we got the DSA in 1973. And all that stuff is important, even for those of us, and I will admit I'm one of these people. I'm sorry, Mike. Even for those of us who think that the DSA isn't radical enough, or that Social Democrats USA is some sort of weird throwback to a different union era, these organizations are still important, and stuff still happened because of things that they were doing. And those stories don't get told because they don't fit the capitalist narrative. And us more radical people should be appreciative of what's been done around the edges by the realignment people, even if we don't believe that realignment is still a valid idea. I think that's a good place to close it out for the night. I want to thank Mike and Brian for coming on. I really enjoyed having you on. I want to have you both back. I'm glad that Kennedy's been helping me out with these shows lately. He's been doing great. I'm really glad to have Kennedy on. People have been telling me they really like seeing Kennedy and that they speak to their experiences. Kennedy, people are telling me that they relate to you.
That's so touching.
Yes.
Nice job, Kennedy.
Well, I do my best to speak to the things that I can.
I wanted to thank you for
Trending
that.
Team Kennedy.
I wanted to thank you for that on the air because I think it's important.
Well, thank you.
And I also want to apologize because I keep getting pronouns wrong tonight and not correcting it on air. So that's something that I need to work on. But anyway, thank everybody for your time. Thank everybody for watching. And everybody have a good week. And we will see you next Monday.
All right. Be safe. Well.
Thanks. Take care.